As they left that morning, I could detect a strange excitement in the princess, as if it was the first time she'd come alive for months. Oh, she's got plans prepared. Although the prince returned soon after 2 a.m., Diana was not to return until dawn. The following morning, Charles appeared at breakfast at the normal time. He looked preoccupied and fiddled nervously with a piece of toast as he waited impatiently for his tea. Diana did not surface until much later, and then spent the day alone by the pool. Not a word passed between them throughout the entire day. "Sounds as if there was a bit of a jealous tiff last night," said Eve over lunch. "Seems that Diana was doing a bit of point scoring at the wedding." The papers were full of stories about the wedding, revealing details of Diana dancing closely with her tall, handsome friend Philip Doone, while Charles chatted conspiratorially to his old flame Anna Wallace. So they're both of them acting like fools in front of everybody. Apparently Charles had approached Diana halfway through the dance with Doone and asked her to come home with him. Diana, it was said, had laughed in his face and carried on dancing. The prince then left in a huff, according to most reports. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to be doing just one chapter from the Housekeeper's Diary, but that's because this chapter is unusually long for this particular book. We've had chapters short enough in the past to do two at once, but this one was longer and chock full of details, so I didn't want to rush it along in the pursuit of getting two chapters in when... Let's just savor the crazy. Okay, in this chapter, we're going to be covering the fact that their relationship is deteriorating at such a fast rate that it is causing members of their staff to quit because they can't take the crazy drama. It's becoming so toxic to work around these people that it's becoming unbearable. We're going to be talking about the fact that both people, both Charles and Diana, are pursuing their own side relationships. So where last time we were talking about Charles and Camilla, this time we're going to be talking about Diana. We don't go into a lot of detail on what was happening in those affairs because this housekeeper, Wendy Berry, doesn't do speculating on what she doesn't see or hasn't heard from the staff, trusted staff that she knows, one of whom is her son. So she's not going to parcel out any gossip that she's heard about things that are happening, on these little trysts. But she talks about things like how Diana reacted when she'd received phone calls from her lovers, or the infamous wedding that Diana went to, and she really rubbed in Charles's face, her carrying on with one of her affair partners. So we're talking about the one-upmanship between the two of them, constantly trying to score points. They're starting to use the kids in the pursuit of scoring points against each other. So what was before just a sort of this tiff, this uncomfortableness between them, it's now escalating into an all-out war where it's not like I accidentally hurt your feelings, you mistook what I said, you're harboring bitterness because you misunderstood something that happened. Now it's both of them actively working to hurt the other person's feelings and enjoying rubbing it in. We're going to talk about Charles's love of Polo and Diana's disdain for Polo and how that was a constant tension point between them and how they used even Polo to get back at each other in various ways. You'll see how they do that. But it's an unfortunate look at both of them. We even see a side of Charles in this chapter that I was disappointed to see because I understand that he grew up in a very elite environment. But I think that his sort of inability to imagine what it is to not be in that elite environment sort of surprised me. And it sort of showed that he really didn't think very much of his staff. Like, he appreciated what they did, but as human beings, he didn't think they had that much to give other than the little bit of servitude that they were able to offer him. And that was disappointing. We also see sort of a jealous streak rise up in him because Diana didn't have a problem making friends and being human with the staff. And I will say that about Diana. Everyone said that she was the princess with the human touch, but that really, I think, was a gift that she had that many other people in her surrounding circle did not know how to do. Like, they didn't know how to cross the barrier between being like the elite and then this, like, the servants. I think that her ability to transcend that invisible line made Charles jealous. Because he didn't know how to do that in a relaxed way. He knew how to be polite to everybody, but he didn't know how to genuinely relate to them. And that was a thing that no one had taught her how to do. And so it certainly wasn't a thing that she could teach him how to do. Certainly not at this point in their relationship anyway. She's not going to help him out in any way. But anyway, there's, as you can see, so much we cover in this chapter. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Chapter 7, The Art of Scoring Points. Now, in this scenario, in this first story that we get, we are setting the scene for the disdain that has risen between them. Charles is late for a dinner that he had promised Diana he would be at. They're just having dinner together, but apparently she was looking forward to it. He blew it off because he got busy. And it's sort of just setting the stage for, that's kind of how he was. If he had plans with people and he got busy doing something, tough luck. We'll meet up again another time. And instead of having dinner with her, he invites friends over for drinks later, completely blows past the dinner engagement that they had together. And so it's just sort of setting the stage for the way he viewed her as not very important. The chapter begins. The princess rang through to the pantry from her sitting room. "Do you know what time the prince is coming back?" she asked somewhat touchily. "I thought we were meant to be having supper together this evening." Charles had left early that morning to hunt with a pack of hounds several hours' drive from Highgrove. Patty had gone with him, and as it was now 7:45 p.m., we were all wondering what had happened to them. I told her we would have heard if there had been a puncture or accident, and that unfortunately the PPO's mobile phone was still out of range, either because they were in hilly country or because it had accidentally been shut off. "So inconsiderate," muttered Diana before hanging up. I could feel the storm clouds gathering, and I gave a secret prayer that Charles would return soon. Mervyn did not seem too bothered, however. The food for their supper was all prepared and just waiting to go into the microwave. Shortly before 9 p.m., Patty, Charles, and his detective arrived, the prince appearing at the main door with a slightly pained expression due to a minor fall that afternoon. He went straight through to his study and rang for some tea and whiskey. Seconds later, I heard the door of the princess's sitting room slam shut, and Diana ran down the stairs. She barged past James, who was in the passageway with the prince's tea things, and dashed straight into the room where Charles was sitting in an armchair. "Where the hell have you been?" she asked. "I was worried sick something had happened to you." Charles, who appeared slightly bemused by her appearance, replied with non-committal, "Just got a bit held up." "What about the supper we were meant to be having together?" she retorted. "I don't suppose you remember that, do you? I'm not important enough for you to remember arrangements like that." As James left the room, Charles was trying to explain that he had asked some friends over for a drink that evening. "They're charming people," he continued. "I'm sure you'll love them." "Stuff your friends!" shouted Diana. "If you can't make time for your wife, I'm certainly not making time for your cronies." With that, she walked out and stomped off to her room. Both obviously raced for the phones at the same time. One call from the prince asking James to prepare a drinks tray for 2 guests, and the other from the princess asking for a supper tray. Well, I mean, quite frankly, it's 9 p.m. and she hasn't eaten yet, and it's because she kept waiting around for him, only to find out, he's blown past dinner. And now he's having people over for drinks. I mean, I totally get why she's mad. I'd be mad too. Like, why are you being like this? Well, he's being like this because she hasn't shown in the past that she cared one way or the other. So she can't be surprised now that there are dividends to her disdain. Anyway, when the prince's friends eventually arrived, they were ushered into the pale yellow sitting room. Charles, his face betraying not a hint of the previous argument, as his guests plumped down in the white, yellow, and violet chintz chairs. It was the first of many occasions when Diana refused to come down and meet her husband's friends for a drink or a meal. It soon became obvious to them what was going on, but it never ceased to amaze me how the prince could switch so effortlessly from an angry domestic tiff to a calm social situation in a matter of seconds. It must have come from years of training. The fact that he had either forgotten or simply didn't care about being late for dinner with his wife was typical of the prince's occasional offhand manner with Diana. Though scrupulously polite with her, and with most people, he still possessed a core of selfishness undoubtedly born of his privileged lifestyle. If he was enjoying himself on the hunting field or polo ground, and was not obliged to go to an official engagement, he was quite prepared to jettison previous engagements to pursue the fun of the present. Such an attitude drove Diana to despair and led to the most fearful rows and black depressions. Now, Wendy's going to transition to introducing us to a new character who you know, but we haven't heard about him yet. Paul Burrell, who is going to end up being quite the confidant of Diana, now comes to Highgrove to work. He had previously worked for the Queen, but he has a young family, and they wanted to raise a family in the country, and so this was a lovely appointment for him. So he's joined, and in this telling of him joining, we also are going to talk about his service with the Queen, and we get a little bit more color about the Queen's character, a little bit more about her is revealed behind the scenes. And what I love is that it's exactly what you want to hear. Okay, so Paul Burrell, formerly one of the Queen's footmen at Buckingham Palace, had recently joined us as butler at Highgrove. Although he had seen the prince and princess at first hand before, he was nevertheless surprised by the chaotic state of their marriage. Suppose I'd just carry on, even if they're in mid-fight, he joked one evening after a series of spectacularly loud slamming doors. I'm sure that's what the Queen would expect. Paul, a chubby and friendly character, was to become one of the princess's closest allies over the years ahead. The Queen, who unlike some other members of the royal family was immensely respected by all the staff, had been reluctant to let him go, but was happy that Paul and his wife Maria, who had worked as Prince Philip's maid, could rear a family in the country. The Queen was and is the most gracious of the whole lot of them, my son James told me. She doesn't really have a different private side from her public persona. She was always scrupulously polite and charming, and would pause if she had time to have a quiet word as she passed you. It never amounted to more than, "How are you, James?" and would never be uttered if she was with guests, but it was still more than Prince Philip would do, or others like Prince Andrew and later Fergie, who would often walk around as if nobody else was there. James also remembered the Queen's kindness and loyalty to the old retainers in the other royal residences, some of whom were over fond of the bottle. One of the royal yeomen had been celebrating a bit too liberally one evening and decided to take a little snooze on the back stairs, reported James. Normally this would not have mattered too much, since the royals don't use those stairs, but for some reason that evening the Queen decided to walk that way, looking for a bowl for one of the corgis, and she came across a crumpled heap, emitting highly alcoholic vapors and loud snores. The Queen had to step over him and came into one of the back rooms to speak quietly to the sergeant. "I think Mr. So-and-so might need a hand," she whispered. Nothing else was ever said about the incident. There was no reprimands and certainly no threats or cautions. This incident essentially showed the Queen for what she is, fair and prepared to give people a chance. I love that. I just love that. So in this bit, we're going to talk about the new nanny, but then Wendy also sews in a little bit of color about Diana and her curious behavior from time to time. She transitions from talking about the Queen to say that Paul's arrival coincided with the appointment of a new nanny for William and Harry. Formerly a Great Ormond Street nurse, Ruth Wallace arrived with the boys at Highgrove on Friday, March 13th, 1987. Extrovert, witty, and great fun, Ruth was clearly going to be a great hit with the staff as well as the boys. Unlike Olga, who always ate with the boys in the nursery, Ruth made it clear that she was going to have her meals with the rest of the staff and join in with the pre- and post-dinner drinks. It was obvious from the start that Ruth, an attractive, vivacious girl, had an eye for the men. A born storyteller, she appealed to the detective's sense of fun and spent many a convivial evening with them. "I can see we're going to have some fun and games with this one," observed Patty the first weekend. "But she looks as if she can take care of herself. Let's see how long she can cope with the princess." "Yes, let's." Now Diana, at this moment, came through to the dining room where I was looking at the state of the covers on the chairs. Over the last few months, they had become worn and tatty, having been used by William and Harry, now better behaved, for the occasional breakfast and lunch with their parents. The princess, dressed in a long, heavy skirt and flat shoes, had no makeup on, but still looked fantastic, her slightly damp hair pulled tightly back. She thanked me for getting her shower head fixed the previous week. It was this inconsistency in Diana that made her so infuriatingly difficult to work for. One day she would make a point of coming to thank you for a minor chore like repairing a shower. The next, after you'd really gone out of your way to do something for her, she'd cut you a million miles away in her thoughts. I, like most staff, did not expect continuous thanks, but whereas Charles was consistently polite and considerate to everyone, Diana was not. Now, we're going to transition from the difficulties of working for Diana to talk about how the house was always full of guests, but that didn't always mean that Charles was there. It is Charles' house, but he's finding more and more reasons to not be around. And in this, we're also going to have a look at Charles's character that, I don't know, really disappointed me. I think it was something that I thought he would not stoop to, because it's so rude. You tell me what you think. Okay, the book goes on to say that as a general rule, Charles and Diana tried to make Highgrove their weekend base, turning down invitations to other friends' houses and inviting them instead to their own. In the first few months of 1987, there was overnight stays from Sarah Keswick, daughter of the Earl of Dalhousie, and wife of billionaire banker Chippendale Chips Keswick, the Fellows family, and Sarah Ferguson, by now the Duchess of York. The prince was not always present at these weekends, since unlike Diana, he would often go abroad for 3 or 4 days at a time on private visits. His fascination with Europe and Italy in particular made Charles read everything he possibly could about the country. One of his favorite after-dinner conversations was about the civilizing aspects of the Italian people. He once asked me if I knew anything about Leonardo da Vinci. What an odd question, and obviously, she's a human being. I replied that I had studied him briefly at A level. He stopped, did a double take, and then said, "A levels, did you say, Wendy?" When I told him that I had a degree, he coughed and looking me straight in the eye, asked conspiratorially, "Well, if you're so well qualified, then why on earth are you here? Why are you working as a housekeeper?" Because not all of us just was born into princehood, you jerk. We're not all born to money. I mean, some of us have to make something of ourselves in this world, you know? I mean, goody for him that he can just sort of traipse through life and have everything handed to him. But some of us have to get degrees, and some of us don't get to do what we wanted with those degrees, and we have to find some way of putting bread on the table. I didn't think that the prince had even considered that his staff were of a higher form of academic life than the brain dead. He laughed when I told him that several of us had quite good qualifications. "Good grief," he replied. "I didn't know everyone was so brainy around here." What an unfortunate story. Like, how could he not even surmise that that was a rude way to talk to her? How could he be shocked about it and then almost belittle it too? It would seem to me that if I was so academically intent as he seems to have been, I would have been delighted to find that the people around me could carry on a conversation with me. And that hitherto I had been aware of this, but now, what a boon to be in a house full of people who were quite well educated and could carry on all sorts of interesting conversations with me. But see, he doesn't have the human touch, so how would he ever even talk to these people? All right, well, as I alluded to in the beginning, the staff are quitting because people are sick of it. Things are extremely bad. Diana is in a punishing mood, and it's no longer just, crying jags and whatnot. Now she's getting aggressive, and now she wants to really hurt and embarrass Charles, probably because she knows about Camilla now. She's not here to just cry anymore, because that clearly isn't working. The book goes on to say that by all accounts, the prince and princess's stay at Windsor that Easter was a disaster. Gossip on the royal household grapevine went into overdrive as stories from the couple's indifference to each other reached even the lowliest housemaid and stable hand. The telephone in the pantry kept on ringing after they had left Windsor, with anxious staff asking if the behavior was as bad at Highgrove. One caller, a footman at Windsor for the Easter break, asked if Charles was seeing anyone else. "It's as if Diana is deliberately setting out to punish him for something," he added. "God help us if Charles is being a naughty boy and going on a trip down memory lane with his old flames. The way the princess is behaving at the moment, I wouldn't put anything past her." That May, the couple were reunited at Highgrove. Diana, fed up by the lack of time and attention given to her by Charles, was at her worst. Her early morning swims were followed by hours alone with the children in the gardens or watching videos in her sitting room. At other times, she would take off by herself and not tell anyone where she was going. "It's going to have to stop," said one of the policemen over supper that night. "She can't just drive away into the outside world without explaining where she's going. She should know that by now." Charles, however, did not seem to care. He'd probably hoping something would happen to her, leaving it to the police or personal staff to try to prevent these solitary excursions. He was too wrapped up in his polo and garden to notice the upheaval, often spending hours away from the house and his unhappy marriage. Well, I'm sure he noticed it, but that's why he's not intervening. He doesn't know what to do, and I don't think he really wants to. I think at this point it's like, whatever happens will happen. I'm not going to try to fix this thing. Because I don't think he really wanted it to be fixed. I mean, he didn't really want to marry in the first place. If it can fall apart and he can not have had too much of a hand in it, if it's just sort of crumpled and crumbled and he, didn't push her away in an obvious way, then he can soothe his conscience as he goes about his life with Camilla, which is who he wanted to be with in the first place. With the tension rising, staff felt under increasing stress. My son James, fed up with the atmosphere and stifling selfishness of both the prince and princess, decided he could take no more and handed in his resignation on May 20th. We had a long discussion the evening before about what he was going to do. "It's been fun for a while, Mum, although I did rather resent having to jump to it for the equerries and private secretaries. I thought royal service was going to mean just that," he said rather incredulously. "But the court and the hangers-on took up more of our time than the family itself. The courtiers, usually chinless wonders with a family connection somewhere, were treated to the lifestyle that went out with the Raj. At Buckingham Palace, there was a hotline straight to the footman's room and butler's pantry. They had to be addressed as Sir and Madam because of their position, and the staff were often admonished if they were as much as 2 minutes late. People like Mr. Fellows were typical of the lot of them, polite but ever so unctuous. In the order of things, he was up there close to royalty, so he made sure he got every privilege he could. The below-stairs staff were invisible unless their white gloves happened to be grubby. Then they heard all about it." James added, "I've got to the stage where I just cannot respect the prince and princess anymore. Their unhappy lives are destroying my own, and I don't want to be caught in the crossfire." The crossfire James talked about was even more evident the second week in June, when the prince and princess arrived at Highgrove for a week's stay. Neither appeared able to do anything without annoying the other, and the tetchiness and resentment they felt seemed to infect the whole house. Both took long phone calls from friends round the country. Charles from his old friend Lady Tryon, whom he had called Kanga. What is his obsession with Winnie the Pooh? We've got Kanga, his friend, and Tigger the dog. But anyway. And Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana from girl and bachelor friends from her single days, including Major David Waterhouse and a banker friend, Philip Doone. Remember that name. We were told not to pick up the phone whenever it went on her personal line, but to notify her immediately wherever she was. Occasionally this meant rushing into the garden to let her know, the phone ringing loudly out in her room all the while. We also had a large brass bell by the pantry door that we could ring to let them know that a phone call was waiting. Diana would drop whatever she was doing and dart back inside the house to take the call, sometimes appearing as much as an hour later, her face wreathed in smiles. Yes, things are becoming more and more tangled, as you can see. Well, to add to the chaos of their personal lives, what with these affair partners calling up at the house day and night, we also have the instigating factor of Charles Polo. So it's really going to drive a wedge between the two of them. One, because Diana doesn't care about Polo. And she makes no effort to try to care about Polo, which I think is a mark against her. But then we have Charles, who really is making it way too much of a thing. Considering the fact that his family is not involved in it. Yeah, Diana needs to give a little bit more. But why would she be inclined to give a little bit more to the person who has so little respect for her? Oh, the selfishness. The selfishness is what's causing this big problem in the first place, because he wants her to come. She doesn't want to come. So then he stops asking, and then she's annoyed that he's going off and doing something without them. The boys want to go, but she doesn't want the boys to go. It just becomes this whole messy thing. Wendy explains it like this. On polo days, Charles would appear at breakfast in his dazzling white polo breeches and shirts. Sometimes his polo manager, Major Ronald Ferguson, would drive over to discuss tactics before the match. At other times, the prince would drive over to the ground with his detective in his green Aston Martin and have his pep talk with him there. Ferguson was usually on the phone every day during the polo season. So you can see, it's all-consuming. William and Harry used to get terribly excited when they saw Charles dressed up for polo and plead to be allowed to accompany him. The prince was visibly delighted when this happened, saying that he would love them to watch the match as long as they kept away from the ponies. However, the boys' wish was not always fulfilled. It depended very much on Diana's mood at the time. Some days she acquiesced, even though she detested polo and the accompanying social spectacle. But at other times she explained the alternative arrangements had been made. What would the harm be in letting the nanny take the boys? If she doesn't want to go, then let the nanny take the kids. That's what the nanny is for. To do all the things that you can't seem to find time to do. And if the boys want to go, let them go and celebrate their father. But see, that's the problem. She can't let the boys get too close to him. They might like him better than her. And it's all about power plays at this state of the relationship. The book says, Paul and I began to notice the start of a power play over the boys between the prince and princess. Well, undoubtedly, arrangements had been made on certain days. It was nevertheless patently obvious on other occasions that Diana was putting up excuses and pretexts. "Oh, I'm sorry, darlings," she would say to the boys, "but I did promise Maria that I'd take you over to visit this afternoon. You can go to polo another time." When no other excuse was available, Diana might reluctantly agree to take the boys to one of their father's matches. Yet even there, the power battle was evident, intensely annoying Charles in the process. One morning, after a particularly strenuous game the previous day, which had been attended by most of the world's press, Charles was infuriated to see the papers full of pictures of Diana stretched out in the grass, with young Prince Harry playing quietly beside her. There were no pictures of Charles at all, despite the fact that he had scored several goals. Diana smiled smugly as she looked through the papers, saying to her husband, "Look, darling, these pictures of me and your son. Aren't they good?" Charles, in shirt sleeves and old cotton trousers, cast a quick glimpse at the photos. "Quite the little glamour model, aren't you?" he muttered before leaving the table and walking into the garden. Can you even imagine? Can you imagine the fury that you would feel in your heart at the person who never wants to show up, and then you have a really good game, and that's the game she decides to show up on? Could it be because there was so much press? And they all cared about her, and nobody cared about what you had done. Nobody had any time to print what you had done. I would be enraged. But he has other things to take his mind off of life. The gardens, for one. And the thing is, he had so many of these hobbies, these all-consuming hobbies. The hunts, the polo, the gardening. And then you add on all of his other royal engagements. I mean, his life was packed. The fact that he thought he'd have time for a wife and kids shocks me. But he has a ton of things to do. Diana does nothing. Diana seems to have no all-consuming hobbies. You know, she likes to talk to her girlfriends on the phone for hours and watch TV. And flip through magazines. And this is part of why she's so bored. Had she something to do with herself, perhaps she wouldn't have had so much time to just sit there in anger, rage, and indignation. The book goes on to discuss the prince's gardens, and they were his pride and joy, to the point where other members of the family sort of made fun of him about it. Most visits to Highgrove included a tour of the estate, either long or short, depending on the interest shown. Fergie, more lighthearted with Charles than ever, would pull his leg gently as he offered to show his friends around the flower beds. "You mean you haven't seen the roses?" she would say in mock horror when a guest politely expressed an interest. "You mean Charles has never shown them to you?" Diana and Sarah would then collapse into fits of laughter as the guest felt obliged to walk around the garden with the prince. Charles's other pride and joy was the vegetable garden, his asparagus and rhubarb plot sending him into the seventh heaven. Often he would pick a handful of asparagus stems on his way round and bring them to the kitchen, saying to Mervyn with a mixture of pride and humility, "Have you seen how wonderful this asparagus is? Would you mind possibly steaming it for dinner this evening? I have a feeling it's going to be delicious." As he left the room, Mervyn would look at the sad little handful of vegetables and smile. "Not a particularly healthy bunch, are you?" he would address them. "But picked by the prince's fair hand, so you'll do." Diana found her husband's eccentric love of gardening amusing at first, then intensely irritating. "If only I were as important as his bloody garden," she would moan to Paul as Charles toiled late into the warm summer evening with the gardeners. Well, the gardens don't talk back and cry, so it's easy to see why he's out there. Okay, well, as things are escalating between the two of them, and Charles is showing more and more and more that he doesn't care, Diana has decided to make him care. So they are invited to a wedding. It's a high society wedding with all the most important players. And she decides that at this place, she's going to rub his nose into her affair life and make him care what's going on. But then she's going to snub him all the while. It's as immature as you could possibly imagine. Is this 7th grade, you ask yourself? Is this the fall dance? Well, these people are acting like it isn't anything more important than that. It's only the whole world watching. What of it? The prince's polo had taken a toll on his back, and one morning he came down to breakfast almost bent double, his face twisted in pain. "Oh, Wendy," he moaned, "I can hardly move." The prince's single bed had been changed earlier that year for a specially designed hand-built one with an attached valance. He had specifically asked for certain features, wanting firmer support, but was complaining that morning that he needed something harder still. "I really am going to have to get something done," he said to Diana as she toyed with her live yogurt over breakfast. "Why don't you just give up polo?" she replied. The weekend before William's 5th birthday in June, Charles and Diana attended the wedding of their mutual friend, Lord Worcester. He's getting married to the actress Tracy Ward. Both drove in separate cars to the service and on to the reception at Cornwall Manor. As they left that morning, I could detect a strange excitement in the princess, as if it was the first time she'd come alive for months. Oh, she's got plans prepared. Although the prince returned soon after 2 a.m., Diana was not to return until dawn. The following morning, Charles appeared at breakfast at the normal time. He looked preoccupied and fiddled nervously with a piece of toast as he waited impatiently for his tea. Diana did not surface until much later, and then spent the day alone by the pool. Not a word passed between them throughout the entire day. "Sounds as if there was a bit of a jealous tiff last night," said Ev over lunch. "Seems that Diana was doing a bit of point scoring at the wedding." The papers were full of stories about the wedding, revealing details of Diana dancing closely with her tall, handsome friend Philip Doone, while Charles chatted conspiratorially to his old flame Anna Wallace. So they're both of them acting like fools in front of everybody. Apparently Charles had approached Diana halfway through the dance with Doone and asked her to come home with him. Diana, it was said, had laughed in his face and carried on dancing. The prince then left in a huff, according to most reports. "Sounds like a bit of one-upmanship going on there," added one of the policemen, who had come into the kitchen for a cup of coffee. The prince didn't seem too happy at all. Well, who would be? What an embarrassing spectacle. Not only is your wife dancing with somebody else, but then you beg her to come with you, and she's like, Charles, please, I'm dancing. I mean, how embarrassing. Well, it continues on for the next weekend, because the next weekend, Prince William was turning 5. But their hideous disdain for each other is getting in the way even of them being together for his little sake. He's turning 5, and he's getting older. And children, they're not dumb. They can feel it when things are wrong, especially when one person's crying all the livelong day. But even if nobody's crying, even if no one's screaming, if you hate each other, your kids know it. Prince William, by now largely over his jelly-gargling days, had handed over the mantle of royal rascal to his younger brother Harry, who apparently never decided to shrug that off. Age 5, on June 21st, William was treated to a party thrown by his mother, while Charles thrashed away on the polo field. Couldn't even be bothered to go to his kid's birthday party. We're really having problems here. But then again, Diana, why are you throwing a party on a day when he can't be there? Still, though, if June 21st is William's actual birthday, and I think that it is, his dad should have been there and should have been like, sorry, I can't make that game, or we need to reschedule, or whatever the case may be. That evening, Princess Anne's Skimpter car pulled up in the back courtyard with Anne at the wheel and a detective beside her. Dressed informally in jeans and a cotton shirt with her hair held back in a loose ponytail, the princess looked marvelous. I had not realized how slim and attractive she was when away from her official public duties. She looked in on me in the kitchen as she walked through to the hall. Hello, it's Wendy, isn't it? She said as she passed. Zara did so enjoy her day here recently. Is my brother back yet? Charles, in shorts and bare-chested, was sitting on a comfortable chair in the sunshine. He got up to kiss her. How nice of you to call by, he said, before ordering some Pimm's for them both. Both ate an early evening dinner outside on the terrace. Despite Diana's public statements to the contrary, she never enjoyed an easy relationship with Charles' sister. Though informal greetings came naturally, there was no real warmth between them, undoubtedly because they had nothing in common. Anne, like Charles, was a country person who shared with him an interest in horses. Diana was a city girl at heart, who could think of nothing more boring than discussing a horse's form ad nauseum. Diana popped her head round the door to say hello, but politely refused to offer to join them. I must go and see William, she said. It's his birthday, you know. Yeah, it is his birthday. Why are these other two people not joining in on the celebrations? I don't get anything that's happening in this house. But to add to the general confusion, they're having another one of these staff get-togethers. It's a staff barbecue now, and everyone's coming in from London up to Highgrove for the barbecue. But it's another one of these confusing events where Charles and Diana, just like everything's just hunky-dory, we're all getting along, we're just one big happy family, ha 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 ha. Joking, carrying on, laughing, everything's great. Except it's not great because all of these people have seen you two acting like psychos. But we're all just supposed to put on our party hats and, throw back the wine and everything's just good. I just wouldn't know what to think. I mean, talk about whiplash. Wendy says that after a grueling few months of friction and headache, the annual staff barbecue on July 10th was anticipated apprehensively. However, none of us had any need to worry. The whole day passed happily with Charles and Diana mingling with the guests and laughing aloud as if they didn't have a care in the world. Other household staff were bussed up from London for the evening, and by 11 p.m. the event had turned into quite a party. Drink was flowing, and slowly couples went off for romantic long walks around the gardens. Charles came up to me and a group of people and talked about the wonderful scents coming from the garden that evening, before complimenting the white wine we were drinking. Someone giggled as he said how nice he thought it was. It was basically plonk, and Charles, who took no interest in wine apart from his favorite, was not fooling anyone. She tells the name of his favorite wine, but I'm going to screw it up. This was his favorite. Here, so if you are curious. But the prince would often be sent crates of wine as presents, but would not really know how good it was. This led to certain members of staff who prided themselves on their good palates making off with a few natural breakages of exceptionally good wine whenever they could. Party hotted up. Diana danced and chatted with staff that she'd cut as recently as the day before. Again, what is happening here? You literally fired me yesterday, and then you're coming up to me and just laughing and joking and acting like it's just all good in the neighborhood. Later on, we were all invited down to the detective's house, Long Furlong, to continue the party. They'd put up lights in the garden and arranged a small sound system to carry on with the dancing. The prince and princess were invited, but Charles, fearing that his presence might make people uneasy, declined. Diana, however, readily accepted and joined the rest of us. Charles, who thought his staff should have their own privacy and that the firm line between staff and friends should not be broken, made a comment to Diana, And she replied, "Oh, don't be so silly," and walked away. At long furlong, she kicked off her shoes and danced with anyone who would join in. Some slow number she danced alone, gyrating to the music with a surprising determination. "Come on, Wendy," she shouted above the din. "Dance with me to this one." I jigged around as she stylishly threw herself into one of the chart records that year. I told her I was getting a bit old for this sort of thing. "No, you're not," she cried as the music moved to a faster tempo. The princess seemed at her happiest when hurling herself round the dance floor with Ken, who, knowing some fancy footwork, was able to match all her steps. None of us got to bed until dawn. What a weird, wild world this is. And, I don't know, was it right that Charles didn't go? Or would he have learned a thing or two by putting himself in uncomfortable situations because he's not comfortable with the staff? That's why he's so unfailingly polite, because he knows that's the right thing. You can't mess up being kind, or at least surface level kind. But he doesn't know what to say to them. He doesn't understand their life. And his comments about Wendy's education shows that he doesn't understand them, or where they came from, or what they are beforehand. But wouldn't it have been a good idea if he had? And I think the reason he got so along with Patty is that Patty is the sort of person that he expects them all to be. Good-natured, kind, rough around the edges, just the salt of the earth sort of people. But he doesn't know what to do with people who have educations that, not that they rival his own, but at least match him intellect for intellect. See, he thought Patty was beneath him, and that's why he was friends with Patty, because he understood the lines there. But he doesn't understand what to do with somebody like Wendy, who had an exceptional education and was very intelligent. What do you do with something like that? You can't pull the wool over their eyes. Not that he could pull the wool over Patty's, but I think that, like I said, Patty presented no threat to him. And so he was able to let his guard down. All right, well, the book goes on to shift the topic of conversation to the kids and what they were like at this time and sort of just the way they fit into the household and what was going on there. The boys loved to play this little game where anybody who came up to the property, they would run out in front of them. They'd be dressed as two menacing soldiers, and they'd have their face painted in camouflage paint, and they'd stop the car, and they'd have their water guns, and they would demand that you have to pay them some money, and they wouldn't let you pass it. You paid the toll, and everybody played into their games. They really loved it. But Wendy says, though, that it used to be quite charming to see how delighted they were in receiving the cash. It was also interesting to see how seriously Harry in particular took the game. Not for him the waste of an opportunity. Why take 10p profit when 20p was easily attainable? Any attempt to escape was a very grave mistake, for the boys were usually hiding in the bushes, and on seeing someone trying to clear the path would race towards them shouting, "Charge!" letting off great squirts of water from their pistols. I learned from bitter experience that unless I was armed with my own water jet, a bottle usually used for watering the plants, I would not make it back to the house without getting soaked. Both children enjoyed harmless practical jokes. Nothing serious ever happened to their victims apart from a little loss of dignity. One day when Charles was on an official trip in the red helicopter of the Queen's flight, he was attacked from behind by Harry, dressed in an army kit. Charles, in a dark formal suit, was jumped on just yards away from the helicopter. Unfortunately for him, Harry had been rolling around earlier in the paddock and was liberally covered with sheep dung. As a result, the prince's back was now striped with green and black stains. Fortunately, his valet was on hand to point this out, and Charles marched back indoor for a hasty wipe-down. The damp patches on his suit were then dried with a hairdryer while the helicopter was kept waiting for a full 15 minutes. "Look at me," moaned Charles as he walked back into the house. There was no tantrums and no recriminations. I think he could see the joke as much as the rest of us, who had to rush out every few minutes to stop ourselves laughing. The grounds of Highgrove made a perfect adventure playground for William and Harry, who were able to run round freely without being constantly shadowed by their personal protective officers. Perhaps the most enduring of their games involved the woodshed. Here was a large net filled with thousands of multicolored small plastic balls which William and Harry would dive into and swim through for hours on end. The balls softened any fall and were perfect for hurling naughty young boys into when a half-serious punishment was called for. There were shrieks of laughter as I or a policeman picked them up after drenching from their extra-powerful water pistols and tossed them into the shed. The extra bonus was that it made us feel a lot better as well. Although both boys enjoyed riding in the early days, it was Harry who pursued the hobby. The doctor was later to ban William from riding after he was accidentally hit over the head with a golf club at Ledgrove School. The fear was that a further injury to his skull might lead to a complication later, and the decision was taken to keep him away from contact sports and potentially dangerous activities like riding. I don't think it bothered him too much, since his interest was already waning. Oh, that would have been disappointing, though, later on in life. I wonder if that ban was ever lifted. Like most young children, William and Harry liked to keep up with all the latest TV programs. They were fortunate in having a TV soap addict for a mother. Had it been left to Charles, very much part of the old too much television is bad for you school, neither boy would have seen more than one program a week, and that would probably have been a documentary. Diana, however, simply adored soaps, such as Casualty and Angels. She had a fascination with medical and police dramas, which often led to long conversations with the staff about the plot the following morning. Maybe that's why she shows such interest in hospital work, I thought to myself. As in any family, there were tears if William and Harry were not allowed to watch their favorite TV program, and Olga Powell and Ruth Wallace were both stricter than their mother in rationing the amount of television. Both boys adored videos as well, and would sometimes plead to go on Saturday afternoon to choose one in Tetbury. Diana had her own television and video in her sitting room, which meant the boys could also watch with her, and a set in her bedroom, which William in particular used to watch, tucked up in bed with her. How unfortunate. That so much of the time that she spent with the boys was just them in front of a screen. And that, I think, is what she would choose for them to do, oftentimes, rather than go and do things with Charles. My husband is also very much in the school of, we're not watching TV in this house. I mean, as I've mentioned before, we don't even have a TV. But if you really believe that, Charles, then you need to make sure that it's happening. You can't just be like, well, I tried, but I couldn't manage it. I mean, it is bad. Your kids don't need to be sitting for hours in front of the TV. Oh, me. Poor Charles. But, I can't say poor Charles too much because I just don't feel like he fought enough for the life he wanted. And yes, I'm not there. I really am not. But it just seems like his hobbies, because hobbies are fun and no one's going to bother you while you're on the polo field or in your garden or, on the hunt. Like all of those things, there's like these goals that you can pursue without it becoming a personal thing. And here, with Diana, I mean, there's just so much opportunity to be disappointed. I just don't feel like he coped well with disappointment. I feel like he always pursued things that he knew he was either going to do well at, or if there was disappointment, it would be mild. Wendy takes a sharp turn in conversation and begins to talk about how the house was infested with bugs. And one of the reasons is that they had too much wasted food on the premises, and so the bugs just feasted. So many things I'm finding out about that I'm like, man, this is wild. This is really strange. She says, while most large country houses might require a thorough spring cleaning, Highgrove needed a total de-infestation throughout the entire summer. As soon as the weather turned hot, the house was completely overrun with flies, moths, and maggots in the cupboards. Many of the problems arose from the ancient stockpiles of supplies stashed away in the kitchen. Also, they kept that house so boiling hot in the wintertime with all their log fires, and the fact that the central heating system was just always broken, so the house was just roasting. It's probably keeping all those insects alive in the walls. Anyway, it was time to call the Highgrove Mothman, Mr. Daly. He stared in amazement at the amount of dry foodstuffs lying around and warned that if much of it wasn't destroyed immediately, he might as well pack up here and then and never bother to return. The hoarding of food on the one hand contrasted uneasily with the terrible waste in the day-to-day running of the catering. Vast amounts of food were ordered on a daily basis, but much was never used. Mervyn had a penchant for thick, heavy cream-based sauces and would order gallons of dairy products every week. And when these went off, as they frequently did, they were tipped down the sink, causing such blockages that we were all sent memos about waste disposal. The fridge was always stocked to its limit whenever the royals were in residence. The chefs needed extra supplies to cope with any unforeseen visit by their friends or other members of the royal family. On the other hand, if they ordered precise amounts for the number of guests, they would be caught short. One lunchtime, when 10 guests were expected, Mervyn prepared pheasant and allowed 2 pieces of breast per person. One of the visitors, a retired colonel and landowner with a hearty appetite, helped himself to 4 pieces, which meant someone was going to have to do without. Paul, the butler, spotted this immediately and raced into the kitchen. "Who is going to stand here and take the flak when someone doesn't get their pheasant?" he shouted at everyone. "I'll tell you who! Me! I'm going to get blamed for some almighty cock-up when it's not my fault! What do you want me to do?" he bawled at Mervyn. "Go over to Colonel So-and-so and take 2 pieces of pheasant off his plate?" The whole scene was like something out of Fawlty Towers. Mervyn looked in the fridge and saw a piece of chicken that he was saving for the dog's dinner. He whipped it out, muttering, "Sorry, Tigger," and slammed it under the grill. Who's the least important guest, Paul? He asked. Make sure you serve him this. Fortunately, the guests were still busy talking and drinking, and some had not yet been served when Paul dashed in 5 minutes later with a very rare piece of chicken. The book goes on. It would appear that things are terrible because nobody has any goals. Nobody has any strong ambitions for tomorrow. It's all these small little, like, tending the gardens and the polo and this and that, but it's just one long, dreary stretch of life without anything really to gain. And of course, Charles's whole life has just been in a holding pattern waiting for his chance to become king. So it would just feel like so much of your life is just stretching out into infinity without anything real to hold on to, without any real gains to make. And I think it's this dreariness that is leading to so much of the cattiness between he and Diana. By September, relationships between the prince and princess had taken yet another turn for the worse. Diana seemed to go out of her way to irritate Charles, who would take no notice of her. She would ask deliberately obvious questions about the garden in a mock-serious tone, heavily laced with sarcasm. "Who is getting the benefit of your wisdom today?" she inquired one morning as he appeared in his old gardening clothes. The prince ignored her. With yet more storm clouds brewing, Diana's mother, Mrs. Frances Shan Kidd, came down to stay on September 11th. Pointedly, Charles was away for the weekend. It was a thrill for the boys to have their other granny staying at Highgrove, especially in such a relaxed and informal environment. The days were spent lounging around by the pool and eating together on the terrace. William and Harry, by now, were able to sit at table and have proper conversations, loving the fact that they were allowed to eat with the grown-ups. The weekend provided Diana with a much-needed tonic as well. Both mother and daughter looked sad to part on Monday morning. Many things had obviously been discussed between them in the absence of Prince Charles. After the initial close friendship with Fergie and Diana, it was a surprise to find the Yorks weekending with Charles alone in the end of October. Sarah had grown to rely on Prince Charles for his advice as the fickle popular press's adoration for her began to wane. She was often on the phone to him, ringing through to the main house if she could not raise him on his personal line, asking for his comments on future projects and plans. Charles seemed genuinely fond of his sister-in-law and admired her strong, earthy nature. It made a welcome contrast to his wife's sulks and black moods. As just a point there, sort of just to interject, side note here, it's no surprise to me that Fergie is now no longer super close with Diana. Not just because Diana is difficult and hard to get along with, so of course anybody would eventually gravitate away from her, but because I have an idea that Fergie was friends with Diana because she knew Diana had a connection to Andrew and she wanted to get married to Andrew, but now that she is, what does she need Diana for? She doesn't have to put up with Diana's moods. The prince, Andrew, and Sarah sat together in the drawing room for many hours as the rain tumbled down outside, talking from early morning right through lunch and into the late afternoon. The mood was relaxed and informal, and there seemed to be a strong common bond between them, which was not always apparent when Diana was present. The following day, Charles was off to Germany with Diana for an official tour, and judging by the initial press reports, it appeared that his talks with his brother and sister-in-law had done him some good. Both the prince and princess seemed to be putting a brave face on things and trying to work through their differences. Charles seemed to be finding solace in his family, inviting Prince Edward and his girlfriend at the time, Georgie May, to Highgrove for his 39th birthday on November 14th. There was a special dinner for the four of them that evening when Charles opened cards and small gifts from his family and staff. "Not much of a birthday party," murmured the girl washing up in the kitchen. "There don't seem to be that many laughs at any rate. Sounds more like a wake." The following day, the Reverend Ian Hazelwood arrived at the main door at 8:30 a.m. clutching a small traveling case containing a silver platter and cup, as the prince frequently liked to celebrate communion in the privacy of his own home. Charles was the only one who made it to the service, and afterwards had a full English breakfast with the minister in the dining room. Diana chose to have a long lie-in with the boys at her side. Can I just make a small point here about Charles taking communion by himself, brought to him by the Reverend, and having a service by himself? The fact that they would even allow that is wrong. Because communion is supposed to be taken together in the community of other Christians. It's not like a little thing you do by yourself. And I know that Charles is a little bit fastidious and maybe doesn't like the idea of drinking out of the cup that everybody else was drinking out of. I don't exactly know how they serve communion at this particular church, but sometimes that is what they do. You know, you go and you kneel and they bring you the cup and they have the cloth and they wipe the edge of the cup and then you're basically drinking after like 75 other people. Maybe that grossed him out. But they do usually have the little cups if you don't want to drink out of the big cup, if for whatever reason you have that problem. And I just think that this is strange that they would accommodate him on this level. It's not right. It's just, It's more of this stuffiness, more of this elitism that you're going to literally, it's called communion for a reason. And I just find that odd. And cold and sad that he would be taking communion and his wife and kids nowhere to be found. They're still laid up in the bed. I mean, it's like, whether men realize it or not, you do have a burden to be the spiritual leader of your household. And just because you yourself are continuing to quietly, secretly practice your religion in your own sort of warped way, you need to call your wife and kids to do it with you, to not just allow them to lay abed. And that's what I don't like about Charles, is that whether he does things by himself, he seems to think that because he's doing them in isolation, they count. But you personally doing the right thing, but then never galvanizing anybody around you to try to do the same, and it's your requirement and responsibility to galvanize the family to do right, but you're just sort of like, well, I did the right thing, so I guess that counts. It doesn't. You don't get any extra points. You know, to constantly avoid your wife and then pat yourself on the back because you didn't have an argument with her, you don't get credit for that because you aren't willing to go into the fray. To practice your religion and have the reverend over and do communion quietly and nobody's around and you're just doing it and then, you know, go into the service but not rousing your wife and kids to join you, you don't get credit for that. I'm tired of him passively walking through life. And this was a long time ago, so I'm not saying that this is the sort of person that he is now. I mean, this was decades ago. And I'm sure that he learned a lot from these experiences and the constant reflection of everything he does in the media back at him. So I'm sure he does things differently now. I hope that he would. But it sort of reminds me of the whole situation with he and Harry, that he's just sort of passively looked at that as, well, I'm not saying anything bad about him. He's talking bad about me, but I'm not, so I get credit for it. But do you, though? Because are you trying to actively pursue a relationship with your son? Like, if I were in his position, come hell or high water, you would see me on a plane flying over to America to make things, to like meet with him. Like, I wouldn't just keep waiting for him to come to my ground. Screw what everybody thinks, what all the eyes on me. If my son is estranged from me and has some wild and crazy narrative that I'm against him, I know that Harry has been told by his dad that I'm not against you, but always on his own turf. What if he went and spoke to Harry on Harry's own turf and said, hey, somewhere things went off the rail. And I've read your book, and so these are some of the things that you said, and I just want you to hear from my mouth that it's not true. And like explain to him, but like humble yourself enough, get into the fight enough that you aren't always looking for things to be on your turf where there can't be a big disappointment. I just don't feel like Charles is of the character to ever stick his neck out. And I wish that he would. Anyway, that was a long jag just because he decided to take communion by himself. Anyway, the book goes on to say that Diana, the boys, Edward, and Georgie all departed that afternoon while Charles stayed on for meetings. There was a miserable atmosphere. Charles and Diana could barely bring themselves to kiss each other as she walked through the back door and stepped into her car. Things looked so bad that none of us were really sure if they would be sharing many more weekends at Highgrove again. Now enter a villain. After Diana leaves, and thank God she took the boys with her, who should show up on the scene but Jimmy Savile? Who? Rather than the prince's other good friend, Spike Milligan, Jimmy seemed able to get to the heart of Charles' problems within a matter of minutes. As he waited for the prince, he puffed on his cigar and sent great clouds of blue smoke into the air. He knew that smoking was officially frowned on in the house, but just laughed it off, saying, "Oh, the boss won't mind. He knows how much I like my cigars." Strolling around in his tracksuit with the laces of his training shoes left undone, Jimmy Savile was the most unlikely spiritual comforter for Charles that one could have imagined. He would drive up in his enormous mobile home and leave it parked like some incongruous monster in the backyard. "Oh, Jimmy," laughed the prince as Paul ushered him through the drawing room. "How nice of you to come." The pair remained shut away together for over an hour. That doesn't make me feel very good. And I know everyone's like, well, he didn't know anything about Jimmy. No one knew what Jimmy was up to, but somebody knew because when they made the documentary, tongues were wagging. Anyway, the atmosphere of crisis rose yet a further notch when Mrs. Shand Kidd arrived for a second weekend on November 21st. Charles had originally planned to travel to Scotland that weekend, but canceled his arrangements at the last minute. He, Diana, and her mother stayed up talking late into the night as the boys slept upstairs in the nursery, unaware of the discussions below. Charles and his mother-in-law seemed perfectly at ease in each other's company, and if anything, he seemed to make an effort to show how normal and considerate he could be. However, as soon as she had gone, the prince resumed his hedonistic lifestyle, hunting and traveling around the country. On December 22nd, a grand ball was held for staff at Buckingham Palace. The doors opened in the historic main hall, and the Queen and her family walked slowly through. The Queen and the princesses present looked stunning in their ball gowns and tiaras as they circulated and talked to individual members of staff. Diana, unlike the others, seemed to have the common touch, giggling and blushing with staff as if she were one of them and not the Princess of Wales. I could see Charles watching her out of the corner of his eye as she went round the room. He looked at her as she took the mother of one servant in his arms and kissed her expansively on the cheeks. Charles' expression was one of horror mixed with fascination, that any wife of his could behave so normally with ordinary people. The horror seemed to rise out of a fear that she had taken over from him as the most important and popular young royal. And there was nothing he could do about it. And that's where we leave off today. What a shocking chapter on so many levels. All these little tidbits. It's not as though we're reading something, say, as shocking as Lady C's book that wanted to let us know that Diana had had an abortion, which I don't even know if that's true now, but nothing like that. Nothing grody and disgusting, and you sort of feel a little perverse for knowing about it. But all sorts of interesting lifestyle tidbits, which I think are some of the most interesting things. History is always more interesting when we're talking about the day-to-day of what people are doing. And I've always thought that I don't care about the big moves of history. It's all those little tidbits that are left in people's diaries that I think are the most interesting. So we're just getting page after page after page of all these sort of side points, and yet just really help you to understand these people on a greater level. So I am just loving this book. And I would say that it's one of the most interesting we've read so far. And judging from your comments, you guys are enjoying it as well. So I'm so glad I'm not the only one enjoying it. I did get the Beckham book in the mail, which is good, but I still want to do the Kennedy book first. And that's actually supposed to come today. But we're going to finish this one first because I can't have so many books juggling, because I've got this book we're reading. Then, of course, on Sundays, we're going to be doing the Mountbatten book. And I literally don't have the time to throw in another book on top of that. So we'll finish this book about Diana, then we're moving to the Kennedys, and then we'll move to the Beckhams. So that's the order of things. Anyway, it's been so good chatting, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.